The Ever Given, the mammoth container ship that famously blocked the Suez Canal, captivated the world's attention in March 2021 as the ship's grounding brought one of the world's most vital waterways to a standstill. The Suez Canal, a 120-mile-long artificial waterway cutting through the Isthmus of Suez in Egypt, stands as one of humanity's most remarkable engineering achievements. Conceived and realized in the 19th century, it's since become a lifeline of global trade, dramatically altering the landscape of maritime transportation. Prior to its construction, vessels had to navigate the treacherous and lengthy route around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, to travel between Europe and Asia. The canal's opening in 1869 heralded a new era of efficiency, allowing ships to bypass this arduous journey and significantly reducing voyage times. In modern times, the Suez Canal remains a vital conduit for international commerce. It serves as a critical shortcut for approximately 12% of the world's total trade volume, enabling goods to flow between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The canal's strategic importance cannot be overstated, as it not only saves time, but also reduces fuel consumption and carbon emissions, aligning with global efforts to promote sustainable shipping practices. Integral to the story of Ever Given and the Suez Canal is the role of container ships, the workhorses of modern global trade. Containerization revolutionized the logistics industry, making it possible to efficiently transport vast quantities of goods across oceans. Standardized containers could be seamlessly transferred between ships, trucks, and trains, streamlining the supply chain. These colossal vessels, often spanning hundreds of meters in length, are capable of carrying thousands of containers and have reshaped the dynamics of international commerce. Containerization not only reduced labor costs, but also dramatically increased the scale of global trade, making it possible for companies to source materials and distribute products worldwide. Container ships like Ever Given represent the embodiment of this paradigm shift, built to maximize efficiency and capacity. Ever Given was built in the bustling shipyards of South Korea. It was constructed by the Korean company Samsung Heavy Industries and delivered to the Japanese shipping company Shoei Kisen Kaisha in 2018. Commissioned to operate under the Evergreen Marine Corporation's flag, Ever Given was part of a new breed of mega container ships designed to maximize cargo capacity and operational efficiency. The vessel boasted an impressive length of approximately 400 meters and a width of 59 meters. Its immense size made it one of the largest container ships in the world when it was launched. Ever Given was equipped with cutting-edge technology, including advanced navigation and communication systems, ensuring safe and efficient operation during its journeys across the world's oceans. The vessel was a marvel of maritime engineering. It had a total container capacity of over 20,000 20-foot equivalent units, showcasing the industry's relentless pursuit of scale economies. The ship's design incorporated modern safety features such as double-hull construction, electronic navigation aids, and state-of-the-art ballast systems for stability. Despite its immense size, Ever Given was powered by a highly efficient and environmentally friendly engine, complying with international emission standards. Its massive scale allowed it to carry a wide variety of cargo, from consumer goods and electronics to industrial machinery and vehicles. The ship's dimensions, combined with its advanced infrastructure, made it an emblem of the container shipping industry's evolution. Before its ill-fated grounding, Ever Given had a busy schedule, plying the world's oceans as part of the global logistics network. It made regular voyages between ports in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, facilitating the movement of goods essential to modern life. Ever Given's journey leading up to the Suez incident was uneventful, as it adhered to rigorous safety and navigation protocols. The ship's routine operations reflected the seamless integration of these massive vessels into global supply chain, where precision timing and efficient handling of cargo were paramount. However, all of this was about to change dramatically. In the quiet hours of Tuesday, March 23, 2021, at 12:12 a.m. Egyptian local time, the Ever Given silently entered Suez port under the cloak of darkness to join the queue of vessels already waiting at the Suez Canal's southern entrance. It was just another addition to the aquatic waiting room, biding its time before embarking on the canal's half-day journey to the Mediterranean Sea. For the next 5 hours and 37 minutes, the Ever Given floated aimlessly, tracing an erratic pattern across the water's surface. It signaled the official commencement of the Ever Given's voyage through the Suez Canal, a journey that would go down in history. Yet the elements were conspiring against the massive ship. Days prior, the Egyptian Meteorological Authority, EMA, had issued ominous warnings. The Khamasine winds, those infamous gusts laden with hot, dry and sandy air, were sweeping relentlessly across the region, causing dramatic temperature spikes and severely limiting visibility. The EMA had forecasted thrilling winds of sand and dust and warned of disruptions in maritime navigation, with predicted wave heights in the Gulf of Suez and the Red Sea reaching 10 to 13 feet. As the Mozaheb II approached the Ever Given on that fateful Tuesday morning, the Suez Canal Authority SCA pilots on board knew they were sailing into treacherous conditions. Pilots, although typically regarded as routine additions to a ship's crew, can become the last line of defense in times of chaos, the guardians of ships facing imminent disaster. At 5:53 a.m., the Mozaheb II departed the Ever Given, leaving behind 2 SCO pilots who would guide the vessel through to Ismailia, a city near the canal's midpoint. There, they would make way for new pilots, who would continue the journey until the canal's end. The arrival of the SCA pilots triggered a crucial briefing with the Ever Given's captain, a moment where vital information was exchanged. These pilots would now become the eyes and ears of the ship, using their local expertise to guide the vessel through the intricate man-made passage. At 6 a.m., Suez port sprang to life. A select convoy of the day's largest and highest priority vessels received clearance to begin their northbound journey through the canal. The Al Nasriya of the Marshall Islands led the way, followed by the Costco Galaxy of Hong Kong, the Ever Given, the Maersk Denver of the US, and others in succession. By 6:21 a.m., the Al Nasriya was at the canal's southern entrance, embarking on its journey. As the convoy advanced, the Ever Given, notably without a tugboat, entered the canal at 7:18 a.m. Its decision to proceed without this additional precautionary measure was not uncommon. Tugboats, though not mandatory for canal transit, are valuable in challenging weather conditions, acting as a safety net to prevent mishaps. However, the Ever Given's speed began to raise eyebrows. By 7:29 a.m., it was hurtling through the canal at a speed of 13.7 knots, significantly surpassing the 8.6 knot limit set by the SCA. Speeds of this magnitude on a megaship of such proportions were a recipe for disaster. At 7:37 a.m., as the ship approached the opening turn of the canal, it made a northwestward maneuver at the mercy of gusting winds. This was the first sign that something was amiss. The Ever Given was now perilously close to the west bank of the canal. When a massive vessel like the Ever Given sails alongside the canal's banks, the water's flows disrupted, creating increased pressure, swift currents, and shallow water that can pull in the ship's stern. This phenomenon, known as the bank effect, is a nightmare for megaships that struggle to correct their course quickly. At 7:40 a.m., the stern of the Ever Given swung toward the west bank, signaling the ship's loss of control. Despite the pilot's efforts to regain control, the ship was at the mercy of the currents and physics. The Ever Given ran aground at 7:42 a.m., with its bow embedding itself into the east bank while the stern impacted the west bank. At that moment, the Suez Canal became impassable. 35 minutes after grounding at 8:17 a.m., the Mosayed II and the Mosayed III tugboats reached the stranded vessel, commencing a rescue operation that would captivate the world for the next 7 days, 6 hours, and 48 minutes. At the height of the crisis, more than 200 vessels were stuck in a monumental traffic jam, anxiously waiting for the blockage to be cleared. The situation sparked concerns among trade experts about potential supply chain disruptions, given the crucial role the Suez Canal plays in facilitating global trade. Tensions ran high as ships trapped in the canal and those planning to cross it faced significant delays. The impact of the Ever Given's grounding reverberated worldwide, underscoring the vulnerability of interconnected supply chains in an increasingly globalized world. No effort was spared to dislodge the Ever Given. 8 tugboats worked tirelessly to free the massive vessel, aided by excavators removing sand from the side of the canal where the ship's bow was wedged. After an initial attempt that saw some progress, the salvage work resumed, making use of a high spring tide to partially free the ship from the sediment on 29 March 2021. However, it wasn't until the afternoon of the same day that the ship was finally freed from its predicament, when the Ever Given finally started moving under tow. Following a thorough examination to assess any damage to the canal's infrastructure, the SCA announced that shipping would resume from that evening. The consequences of Ever Given's blockage were profound and immediate. With hundreds of ships waiting to enter or exit the canal, a significant backlog of vessels accumulated, disrupting the finely tuned schedules of global supply chains. This interruption caused delays in the delivery of goods, ranging from consumer products and electronics to vital industrial components and raw materials. The incident served as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in the global economy. It highlighted the concentration of maritime traffic through critical choke points like the Suez Canal and the potential consequences of such disruptions. The impact of the blockade rippled across industries, leading to increased shipping costs, insurance claims, and re-evaluation of supply chain strategies. For those 6 days in March, as rescue crews worked tirelessly to free the Ever Given, the world watched with intense fascination. But the blockage was more than a spectacle, it had a tangible impact on global trade. Each day, the Ever Given obstructed the Suez Canal. Numerous ships carrying billions of dollars worth of cargo had to wait, causing significant supply chain disruptions that continued to reverberate months later. Once the massive vessel was dislodged, it was escorted by Egyptian authorities to the Great Bitter Lake, a fitting name for the recriminations which were about to unfold. First on the docket was the matter of compensation. Egyptian authorities and the Ever Given's insurer had to agree on the financial responsibility for the rescue operation. This wasn't a small matter, as the operation had involved extensive efforts and incurred substantial costs. Negotiations were not swift, and while they unfolded, the Ever Given remained anchored in the lake, its future hanging in the balance. This period of maritime purgatory generated considerable buzz, with the world eagerly awaiting news of the Ever Given's fate. Media coverage was rife with speculations and discussions about the financial implications and the potential fallout for global trade. The ship that had once blocked the world's most critical waterway had now become a symbol of the complexities and uncertainties of international shipping. During this time, the Ever Given's crew was still on board awaiting the outcome of negotiations. While they were no longer trapped in the Suez Canal, their situation remained uncertain, and their future hinged on the resolution of the crucial talks. The crew's morale likely fluctuated as they faced an extended stay far from home and their intended route to Rotterdam. Ultimately, the negotiations bore fruit. An agreement was reached between Egyptian authorities and the Ever Given's insurer, providing compensation for the extensive rescue efforts. Finally, on July 13th, it set sail for Rotterdam, Netherlands, carrying about 20,000 containers, some of which contained perishable goods. However, the state of these goods remained uncertain after being at sea for more than 3 months. When the Ever Given arrived in Rotterdam on July 29th, local staff had to assess the contents of the containers to determine their condition. Due to the uncertainty surrounding the ship's state, it could only unload cargo and could not take on new cargo. The ship's owner declared a contingency situation, requiring customers to pay a fee to retrieve their goods. While non-perishable goods like bicycles and furniture parts were salvageable, perishable items had significantly deteriorated and were auctioned off or discarded. In August, after unloading its cargo, the Ever Given sailed for repairs in China. This journey took it once again through the Suez Canal and the narrow Singapore Strait. The vessel arrived at a dry dock in Qingdao, China in mid-September, where it underwent repairs to address the damage sustained during the Suez Canal blockage. Fortunately, the damage was not catastrophic, and the repairs were focused on a small portion of the ship's surface. Today, the Ever Given has returned to its duties, once again traversing the seas, but the lesson learned from its grounding continued to resonate in the shipping industry.
Number 5. Its economy is in shambles. Vladimir Putin's refusal to withdraw Russian forces from Ukraine after invading the country in early 2022 was met with widespread condemnation from nations around the world. So in an effort to cripple Russia's economy and paralyze its assets, numerous countries imposed unprecedented sanctions, including the United States, Australia, Japan, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Just to name a few of these consequences, Russia's largest banks were removed from major international payment processing platforms, and state-owned companies were banned from raising capital through U.S. markets. Measures were also taken to prevent Russia from making moves to offset the impacts of the sanctions. Within days, the ruble's value plummeted to a record low against the US dollar. Russian civilians rushed to withdraw their money from banks, and trading on the country's stock market was temporarily shut down. Several months later, an international forum of finance ministers from various countries agreed to cap the price of Russian oil, severely limiting its ability to profit from sales. In the meantime, Russia's military spending spiraled out of control as Putin failed to achieve the swift victory in Ukraine that he'd predicted. In June 2022, Russia defaulted on its international debt payment for the first time in over 100 years, not due to a lack of funds, but because the sanctions prevented Moscow from having any way to make the payment. And by November, the country was officially in a recession. The situation has only worsened throughout 2023. In mid-August, the ruble's value hit a 17-month low. The drop sent inflation soaring, causing prices to rise rapidly. Some economists have predicted that inflation will continue to surge in the near future. The ongoing shortage of workers, which is being exacerbated by the number of soldiers going off to war, has also contributed to rising inflation. In addition to the sanctions, the cost of war and inflation, Russia is currently experiencing a major domestic fuel shortage. Market sources told Reuters that the shortage was caused by multiple factors, including the weakening ruble, which encourages the export of oil, maintenance and operations at oil refineries, and infrastructure bottlenecks on railways. And that means that the workload is so constant that the industry struggles to keep up with it. This causes time and production costs to increase, which is pretty much the last thing Russia needs right now, especially when it comes to one of its most important domestic commodities. One way to combat the problem would be to curb oil exports, but that would mean losing out on profits, which are already strictly limited by the economic sanctions from the West. Some individual refineries have already started cutting sales, and a few have suspended oil sales completely. Many gas stations imposed limits on how much fuel customers could purchase, and some retailers completely ran out of certain types of gas. Diesel is also in extremely short supply, particularly in retail markets, and it's reportedly unavailable in a lot of places. Despite the grim circumstances, Putin claimed that Russia's economy is on the rise and that wages are increasing. But he couldn't deny that inflation is a major concern, and he implored the country's top financial officials to do everything in their power to keep the situation under control. Putin seems worried about Russia's ability to do damage control on its ailing economy, and experts say that the sanctions imposed by the West seem to be working like a slow poison. For now, he remains committed to his goal of conquering Ukraine, and only time will tell if his position will change. Number 4, it's losing the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin and his top cronies seemed confident that Russia would have a fairly easy time seizing control of Ukraine. The prediction made sense, considering the fact that Ukraine's military was vastly outnumbered by and far less equipped than the invading Russian forces. But things didn't go as planned. Russian troops were met with fierce resistance from the Ukrainian fighters, and numerous countries donated military equipment and economic assistance to the Ukraine war effort. Meanwhile, much of Russia's equipment proved to be outdated and in poor condition, with the majority of its tanks dating back to the Soviet era. According to news reports, some tanks broke down on the ride into Ukraine to carry out the invasion, giving their crews no choice but to abandon them and continue the journey on foot. Russian fighters didn't expect the level of pushback they were met with, and it's believed that many didn't want to participate in the invasion to begin with. Needless to say, low morale and poor training have been consistent issues among Putin's forces, who weren't exactly giving their all to the war effort. In fact, Russia's military has failed to recruit the kind of support it needs to continue fighting, and in September of 2022, the draft went into effect. Draft dodging has been a consistent problem, prompting Putin to impose strict new measures against draftees in 2023, along with severe consequences for those who fail to abide by their military orders. And as of February 2023, the number of Russian casualties was estimated at 200,000 and counting. Many of the troops fighting along the front lines are poorly trained, while a large number of Russia's elite soldiers have been misused for missions that fall out of line with their skills and expertise. Ukraine also has lost a lot of troops, although experts say it's difficult to ascertain the exact number of deaths due to the country's reluctance to provide that information. But it's believed that Russian casualties are higher, and it's clear that Putin didn't foresee the losses. Many people are of the opinion that Russia has essentially lost the war and that it's time for Putin to throw the towel in and accept defeat. But he's likely not going to do that, and there are also many people who are far from convinced that a Ukrainian victory is guaranteed. Number 3, Ukraine's counteroffensive. In May of 2023, Ukrainian forces launched a counteroffensive against the remaining 3 Russian lines of defense, occupying roughly 1/5 of the country's land. It got off to a slow start as the Ukrainians struggled to recapture territory from well-defended Russian units. At various points throughout the months-long effort, the ongoing fighting seemed like a battle to see which side could wear the other down faster, with neither being willing to relent. During the first 2 months of the counteroffensive, the Ukrainians had only advanced roughly 10 miles along the 100-mile front that was under Russian control. Slowly but surely, though, Ukrainian troops have made some major advances, despite the ongoing challenges they face in their efforts to seize back the occupied region. They have a few things working in their favor, including the dwindling number of elite Russian forces due to mounting casualties. And according to an update from late August 2023, paratroopers were being sent to fight along the front lines when it's not really the appropriate place for their skill set. Moreover, these highly trained forces are often backed by poorly trained entry-level soldiers, which only causes elite units to die faster. In addition to poor training and strategy, Russian troops also remain plagued by low morale. And based on intelligence that was gleaned from captured soldiers and intercepted communications, some Russians are refusing to fight. In addition to Ukraine's sheer determination, the country's forces are benefiting from donated modern military equipment that they've received from other countries, including tanks, armored vehicles, and weapons. Having state-of-the-art technology has given a major boost to the Ukrainian war effort, even if the advance into Russian-occupied territory has been slow. As of September 2023, Russia still controls around 18% of Ukraine's territory. Casualties have been heavy on both sides, and some have even criticized the counteroffensive as a foolish move on Ukraine's part. The country's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, responded to critics during a meeting among foreign officials by telling them to shut up. making it clear that Ukraine is determined to win back its country once and for all. Do you believe Ukraine has a chance to defeat Russia given its ample support from other countries? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, subscribe. Number 2. Prigozhin's mutiny. Yevgeny Prigozhin was a former convict and Russian oligarch who owned several businesses that provided services to the Kremlin. He was close friends with Vladimir Putin and tightly connected with Russia's defense ministry and its military intelligence agency, the GRU. Prigozhin also founded the Wagner Group, a state-funded private military company that supported pro-Russian militaries in Ukraine since 2014. It played a big role in the 2022 invasion of Ukraine and the fighting that followed. Throughout 2022, the group grew from roughly 1,000 members to somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 members, many of whom were convicts recruited from prison. Then in late 2022, Prigozhin began openly criticizing the Russian military's handling of the war. And a few months later, he expressed anger and frustration at Russian forces for failing to provide the Wagner Group with ammunition. Prigozhin blamed the military for the deaths of several of his men, which he believed would have been prevented if they'd been better supplied. His criticism against the Russians became increasingly harsh over the following months, and he also began calling out the country's top officials and their families for their alleged shortcomings in the war effort. In May of 2023, Prigozhin accused Russian soldiers of abandoning their positions while forbidding Wagner fighters from doing so under the threat of charging them with high treason. Around the same time, he began rebranding his image, touting himself as a spokesperson and advocate for the populace rather than a pro-Putin mercenary leader who'd weaseled his way into Moscow's pocketbook. He got away with saying a lot of things that almost any other Russian public figure would have been arrested or otherwise punished for. When the government began pressurizing Prigozhin to sign paperwork that would integrate the Wagner Group into the military and effectively remove his influence, he refused. Then in late June, he declared war on Russia's Ministry of Defense and called on Wagner Group members to join the fight. Prigozhin claimed that the Russians had attacked his forces first and said that Moscow's justification for invading Ukraine was based on lies and motivated by a desire to further the interests of Russian oligarchs and the government. The next morning, the Wagner Group captured the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don and began advancing towards Moscow. But the rebellion ultimately failed, and Putin refused to even speak with Prigozhin after that. Charges against Prigozhin were dropped, however, after he agreed to move to Belarus. In late August 2023, Prigozhin and 9 other people died in a plane crash while en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Prigozhin's remains were identified through DNA analysis. And while the cause of the crash is unclear, US experts have speculated that there was an explosion on board, suggesting the possibility of a deliberate sabotage. The Wagner mutiny marked a turning point in the conflict. Ukraine's national security chief, Oleksiy Danilov, described it as having started the process of Russia's self-destruction. And at the very least, the rebellion exposed some major weaknesses in Russia's handling of the conflict, and it reinforced any existing knowledge that the Russian military is struggling to maintain its morale. Furthermore, it corroborated previous stories about a large number of Russian troops being poorly trained, bitter toward their government, and, in some cases, unwilling to fight. And at number 1, civil unrest. In Russia, the consequences of speaking one's mind can be severe, especially if their opinion goes against the narrative being promoted by those in power. When the invasion of Ukraine began, government officials issued a stern warning that protesters would face severe legal consequences. Despite this, though, thousands of people flooded the streets of Moscow within hours of the invasion to voice their opposition to the war. Demonstrations were also held in numerous other cities. Over 1,800 arrests were made on the first day of the invasion, but the protests continued, and Putin's mobilization of the draft in September of 2022 triggered another wave of demonstrations. Authorities responded by detaining protesters en masse, and on several occasions security forces fired live rounds into the air. An overwhelming number of people have made it clear to Moscow that they disagree wholeheartedly with the war, even at the risk of being jailed. In one open letter that received 1,200 signatures of support, students and staff members of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations stated that they found it morally unacceptable to stay on the sidelines and keep silent when people are dying in a neighboring state. The letter went on to say that it would take generations of diplomatic efforts to rebuild the trust between Russia and its neighbors. Another open letter, written on behalf of Russian arts and culture workers, demanded the immediate withdrawal of the country's troops from Ukraine. It received 17,000 signatures of support, while an online petition condemning the war received nearly 2 million signatures from Russian citizens. People have found other ways to show they disagree with the war, including by wearing green ribbons as a symbol of their opposition and by promoting the slogan, "No to War." This may not seem like a big deal, especially if you live in a country that affords its people the right to free speech, but it takes guts to vocally stand by one's principles in a place where the country's leader has given police his blessing to throw people behind bars for doing so. Another wave of civil unrest came following the death of Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. By the time he passed away, he'd gone from being one of Putin's closest confidants to gaining favor among a large number of civilians. The Shaft. Mount Gambier is the second largest city in South Australia, but with a population of only 33,000 residents, it is still over 40 times smaller than the next largest city, Adelaide, which is home to almost 1 million people. While it's clearly not a major metropolis, Mount Gambier is considered an important settlement. It's just a few miles away from the country's southern coast in a volcanic region called the Limestone Coast, which is situated along South Australia's border with Victoria. If you're from one of the southern states in the US, then you probably already know that wherever there's limestone bedrock, there's sinkholes. The Limestone Coast, and Mount Gambier in particular, are no exception to this trend. Sinkholes can be extremely fascinating, so it's no surprise that they're one of Mount Gambier's biggest tourist attractions. But they can also be deadly, especially when they become filled with water. The infamous Shaft is a flooded sinkhole, also known as a cenote. It was discovered back in 1938 by a farmer whose horse tripped on it while walking through a field called Thompson's Paddock. As word spread about the newly formed sinkhole, which measures only 3 feet across at its narrow opening, divers came from far and wide to squeeze inside and experience the natural spectacle for themselves. They quickly realized that the shaft consists of a main chamber measuring about 460 by 262 feet at its narrowest, with 2 large tunnels stemming off either side at a depth of 118 feet. People were undoubtedly curious about what was beyond the main chamber, but nobody ever dared to go inside the side tunnels until the tragic expedition in 1973. The 1973 Mount Gambier cave diving incident. On May 27, 1973, a group of 9 diving enthusiasts finished a successful dive at the shaft, traveling roughly 150 feet straight down from the small opening to a bunch of rubble referred to as the rock pile. After briefly exploring the perimeter, they surfaced with plans to return the next morning and dive even deeper into the hole. One of the group members, Joan Harper, ultimately decided not to participate in the next dive and to instead remain near the sinkhole, where she prepared food while waiting for the divers' return. The other 8 divers entered the shaft as planned and descended down to the rock pile. Their original intention was only to explore as far as a narrow, downward-sloping extension of the chamber called the Edge. With almost no visible light from the sinkhole's opening in this area, the largely unexplored section was past the point considered safe for diving at the time. Unaware that they would soon make news headlines for all the wrong reasons, 4 of the 8 divers finished their mission and safely returned back up to the surface, while others explored past the limits that the group discussed before the dive, and they did so without a guideline. What happened next was devastating. The divers got lost and became trapped. They were never seen alive again. At some point, even enough time passed for everyone who made it out of the cave to know that their friends, Gordon G. Roberts, John H. Bockerman, and siblings Stephen and Christine Millett, were long gone. The aftermath. Law enforcement had never taken on a rescue or recovery effort even remotely like this, giving them no chance but to learn the ropes as they went along. The day after the incident, authorities searched the sinkhole down to a depth of 200 feet. Their efforts were short, mainly because they were extremely unprepared for the hazards of cave diving and didn't want to risk losing any more lives to the so-called bottomless hole. After finding nothing with the first search, they tried again the next day, and again they came up empty-handed. At that point, local officials decided it was too dangerous to look any more without consulting experts. In order to extend their search any deeper into the cave while minimizing risks, they would have to undergo months of specialized training. So the effort to find the divers' remains was postponed indefinitely. The first body was discovered by chance about 8 months after the incident, when the owner of the land the sinkhole was in granted a documentary crew permission to enter the shaft. In January 1974, the crew dived down to a depth of 50 feet and lit the cave up using professional lighting equipment. They weren't looking for any of the lost divers, but they quickly found a body in a wetsuit. The spooked filmmakers immediately rushed to the surface and informed police, who removed the body the very next day. Using dental records, they eventually identified the remains of Stephen Millett. While they were inside the cave, officers searched to a depth of 180 feet, but failed to turn up any sign of the other 3 missing divers. Over the next few months, the landowners became increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that there were 3 human bodies mysteriously trapped somewhere on their property. So they took matters into their own hands and contacted a diving team to carry out a recovery mission, but this ultimately proved unnecessary. After taking deep diving lessons from Royal Australian Navy instructors, the police were finally at a point where they were almost ready to conduct a thorough search of the shaft. In March 1974, 3 months after the discovery of Stephen Millett's body and almost a year after the initial incident, a law enforcement team descended down into the sinkhole. Armed with improved diving equipment and skills, they finally spotted the remaining 3 bodies. Shortly after locating the remains of Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts at a depth of 185 feet, the team descended another 20 feet and discovered John Bockerman's body. Over the next few days, officers made several failed attempts to bring the bodies up to the surface. On their 3rd try, they recovered the remains of Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts. They made one more try at retrieving John Bockerman before being sent home for a month to recover after the straining effects of their efforts took a toll on their bodies. After going back to the shaft with yet another batch of improved equipment and additional training, they finally managed to get Bockerman's remains. Would you ever explore a sinkhole? Let us know in the comments down below. Be sure to subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Now, back to the story. Causes. At first glance, it's easy to blame this tragedy on poor decision-making and inadequate planning. It could also be said that curiosity got the best of the 4 divers, causing them to continue deeper into the cave when the rest of their group was ready to call it quits. Investigators concluded that their equipment was in good shape and that they simply ran out of oxygen after failing to find a way out of the cave. This could easily be perceived as additional evidence that the victims deliberately abandoned safety precautions and acted entirely out of recklessness. Flawed judgment certainly played a role in this incident, but to blame it entirely on that is too simple of an explanation as to what really happened, and it would be quite the stretch to accept it at face value. For one thing, the 4 survivors were unbelievably lucky to come out of the shaft alive. They came up with barely any oxygen left in their tanks and could have easily died if they spent even just another minute or 2 exploring. This alone proved that the decision half the divers made to continue on didn't demonstrate a major difference in the judgment, despite the dramatically different outcomes of the 2 groups. All 8 divers could have done multiple things differently that might have prevented the tragedy altogether, but at some point, the circumstances were beyond their control. At extreme depths, scuba divers become highly susceptible to a condition called nitrogen narcosis, which causes an alteration of consciousness. In short, when someone breathes air under pressure that's higher than the atmosphere, they become drowsy and mentally impaired. The deeper a diver goes, the worse it gets. Even at the rock pile's perimeter, which the group surpassed during their dive, the effects of nitrogen narcosis would have been significant enough to drastically affect the diver's judgment. As they ventured beyond that line, their judgment would have only deteriorated further. There are limited ways to cope with nitrogen narcosis once it sets in. The easiest way to reverse its effects is to rise to shallower water. Nitrogen narcosis is rarely an issue when it comes to open water diving, since surfacing is practically always an option. As long as an open water diver is aware of the symptoms and responds appropriately, there are often no long-term consequences. But surfacing obviously wasn't an option for the 4 divers who were trapped in the shaft. Even if they were well aware of their condition, they may have been too confused to find their way out or even too impaired to recognize that it was a good idea to surface when they still had the opportunity. It's impossible for a diver to develop a tolerance for nitrogen narcosis, no matter how experienced and trained they are. Each diver's susceptibility to the sickness is different. In other words, what one person can handle, another person may not be able to, and it has little to do with their past exposure. Although half the group survived, all 8 members were most likely affected by narcosis. But the tragedy can't be blamed completely on the condition. The whole group was guilty of shirking safety procedures even before they would have experienced impaired judgment. They failed to use a shot line that reaches the cavern floor, were not equipped with extra oxygen tanks, and were not well versed in air management strategies that would have maximized their use of available oxygen storage. The group also neglected to use safety lines and did not choose diving partners before entering the shaft. How the accident changed cave diving. Back in 1973, cave diving in Australia was still unregulated. If anything good came from the Mount Gambier incident and several other deadly diving tragedies that happened the years leading up to the shaft cave disaster, it was the formation of the Cave Divers Association of Australia. Immediately after the Mount Gambier incident, way before the 4 divers' bodies were recovered, South Australia's Deputy Premier appointed a committee to investigate safety precautions for scuba divers in freshwater sinkholes and underwater caves. Simply put, it wasn't necessary to find the missing bodies for officials to understand that cave diving is dangerous and that safety precautions likely played a role in the tragedy. In early 1974, the committee made several recommendations for improving safety standards for cave diving. Key among these suggestions were establishing a higher standard of safety among the recreational diving community. As part of this effort, the committee recommended creating educational materials to improve cave divers' knowledge and their awareness of the importance of safety practices. They also asked authorities to install warning signs at sinkhole and cave sites and to seal off deadly locations, including a site called Allen's Big Hole or Death Cave. In the event that these recommendations failed to stop cave diving fatalities, the committee suggested taking control through legislative measures. In other words, they encouraged the government to create legal measures to curb deaths. They suggested multiple ways this could be done successfully, including the creation of a regulatory body that would oversee cave diving, licensing requirements for instructors, and managing sites through patrol officers, and granting access permits only to qualified divers. In a rare display of politicians listening to the experts, the government took the recommendations to heart and followed through. In April 1974, officials announced that they would listen to the committee's advice, including the suggestion to create an advisory body dedicated to recreational cave diving. By then, a group of professional cave divers from throughout the state had already met and agreed to form the Cave Divers Association of Australia. They gave valuable evidence to the committee, and they were clearly the most qualified individuals to advise both the government and civilians on diving safety. With the blessing of public officials, their existence was made official, and the group went to work. Based on its name, the CDAA may sound like a simple club for cave diving enthusiasts, and that's certainly one reason it exists. But it has a much more significant purpose than simply letting people bond over a shared hobby. Since its founding, the group has helped to dramatically reduce fatalities associated with the hobby through new safety measures and regulations. The CDAA has also helped bridge gaps in trust between private landowners and recreational divers by creating a rating system that ranks the level of difficulty at dive sites. The system was divided into 3 unique levels: Category 1 consisted of open, deep-water caverns and sinkholes with minimum overhang or ceiling. Similar sites with considerable overhangs fell in the moderately more difficult Category 2, while Category 3 was reserved for the most difficult and dangerous sites. There was also an advanced Category 3, which was later renamed Category 4. These places consisted of caves that were almost entirely flooded and/or which were impossible for more than one diver to navigate at once. The system was officially implemented in 1974, not long after the CDAA was founded, and remained in effect until 1989, when it was replaced with an even more advanced training system and additional site categories that are still being used today. Thanks for watching. What's the coolest place you've ever explored? Let us know down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.